Welcome everyone here to the Brewers of South Suburbia July monthly virtual. And tonight we have a very special guest in house, homebrewing legend and author and podcaster and damn near anything else you can think of in the homebrew world, Mr. John Palmer. So John, thank you very much for coming. We're going to go through the club motto here very briefly. And that is the Brewers of South Suburbia. We are dedicated to the art of crafting and quaffing fine beers through the sharing of ideas and experiences, the advocacy of brewing as a hobby, and the responsible consumption of beverages containing alcohol. And again, we could not be more thrilled with having you on again to celebrate our 30th year anniversary here. We've done several noteworthy items this year. Specifically, we did a guided tasting with La Trappe in the Netherlands at the beginning of the year. And then Dr. Charlie Bamforth also came on and did a similar Q&A here as well. And, and to have yourself on, many of us have read your books. And we were hoping that, again, that pre-list of questions that I gave you was kind of solicited from the group here. So we can feel free to dive into those at any point. But for those of us who don't necessarily know everything that you've written, because you're fairly prolific, can you kind of talk about your homebrewing background and the initial publishing of How to Brew Online and all of that stuff that, like I said, I already know, but I'm me, right? So hopefully we could share that with the others here and tell them what it's all about.
Okay. Yeah, well, as I was saying, I got started in home brewing shortly after I moved to California in '88. Probably I didn't brew my first batch until 1990. So many people you read about it and you don't actually do it. And finally I got engaged and figured, okay, it's time to start brewing. And first batch was terrible. Tasted like pond water, or more like apple cider, really. It was an American. Of course, you go in to the brew shop with every intention of brewing, an ESB, and then you choose the light lager kit because your wife might like it better. So, yeah, I ended up brewing this cider water that was terrible. And the brew shop owner was like, "No, this is good beer." And it's like, "No, it's not. I've had good beer. This isn't it." So at that point, I got on Rec Crafts Brewing and the Homebrew Digest and started learning how brewing actually worked. And my second batch was documented in the first edition of How to Brew, Lady Liberty Ale, straight pale malt extract and Cascade hops. And the success. And from there, I brewed, I went through the general arc that homebrewers do. You brew something successfully, and then you try to brew something strong, and then you try to brew something exotic, and then you try to brew something, more exotic. And for me, that was a spiced Christmas ale that got a diastaticus infection and fermented out to fizzy water, unfortunately. Of course, my family said, "Oh yeah, we love that." Yeah. Then I brewed another pale ale, and it was nice. And it's like, I really should go back and try perfecting this pale ale. And it's the same progression that you see among all homebrewers and new brew pubs and so on. And oh gosh, that at that time there was Miller and Papazian and Dave Line, but his book wasn't terribly available. So at the time, people were saying, you are good at explaining things, you should write a book. And so I started writing a book. My kids were very small, and it took me 5 years from 1995 to 2000, at which point my publisher went out of business and gave me all the rights back, but they lost my negatives, so I had to retake all the pictures. And at that point, I decided, okay, self-publishing would be too much work. I'll just publish it to the internet. And so I talked to the guy at Real Beer Page, and he goes, sure, yeah, we'd love to have it. So that's how howtobrew.com got launched, in association with the Real Beer Page at the time. And that was 1990, or sorry, that was 2000. And then after a couple of months, I told my wife that the website was very successful, lots of hits, people were complimenting me on it. She goes, oh, good. How much money are we making? And I go, we're not making any money. It's free. She goes, what? You mean 5 years of ignoring the children and we're not making any money off this? So at that point, she convinced me to actually publish a hard copy. And so I had to learn how to do layout, and of course that meant another pass through the text to kind of clean things up, things that I had, noticed that weren't quite right, and so on. And that's how the first edition, the Green Book of How to Brew, got launched in 2001. And I would send boxes of that out to homebrew shops around the country at lunchtime. And then 5 years go by, and I was talking to Ray Daniels at the Homebrew Con, and he said that they would be interested in my next work. And I said, well, I'd like to revise How to Brew. And he goes, we'll do that. So that's how the Blue Book got launched. The second, or what I consider the third edition, because the first edition is the website. Second edition was my green self-published copy. And then the blue one, Brewers Publications, 2006, third. And then today, the yellow edition is the fourth. And that I did that in 2017.
And that book is a behemoth. It's like 600 pages from what you'd originally done, which was probably closer to what, 3?
Yeah, 300, then 300, then 400, and now 600.
Yeah. And that's how much things have changed and evolved since all of those years ago.
Well, I'm happy to say that I've learned a lot over the last 20 years since I published it, and still learning a lot. Because, as you well know, not a year goes by where some new yeast or new technique comes along that really changes things up. As my wife says, don't get me started. I'm happy to talk about anything, so if you have questions, please ask. Otherwise, I'll launch into more dad jokes.
I think that very first question that I sent you, which was probably my favorite out of everything on the list.
That's a good question.
Was without using any fancy science words, tell us as homebrewers, what are the 3 things we can do to water that will improve our beer overall? I thought that was probably my favorite question that I had seen out of everything that had been submitted.
Okay. It's a great question, and I actually wrote down my answers because I wanted to think about it. So the number one reason that you adjust brewing water is for your mash pH. Okay. You want to hit that 5.2 to 5.6 mash pH range. Then, once you've done that, you can also look at that water profile and how you're adjusting it, which salts you're using, and acid additions, to enhance the flavor profile of the beer. And that's your sulfur to chloride ratio. Sulfur, hoppier, chloride, maltier. But that's big arm waving. You cannot create flavors with water salts. You can only enhance what's there. Okay, just like seasoning food. If the flavor's not there, you're not going to create it with salt. Second reason, well, you need to understand water concentrations. You need to understand your home water report. Now, and you need to understand the ranges for high, medium, and low water salts. It's what, the minerals in water. Low concentrations are less than 50 ppm. Okay. If a water ion is less than 50 ppm, as far as a brewer's concerned, it's a low concentration. It's not really going to affect flavor. And it's going to have a very minimal impact on pH. If it's medium, and that is between 50 and 100, then it's going to have an effect. Okay. If it's high, over 100 ppm, then yes, it will have an effect. And most people in the United States, North America, that brew with groundwater will have alkalinity that's greater than 100 ppm. Okay, so basically everybody in North America brewing on groundwater has high alkalinity, which is a problem for brewing light beers or pale beers. Does that make sense? Okay. If anybody
nods, I think
yeah.
I think I've seen my water report once or twice.
Okay.
And because I'm not a huge water guy, but I think even my alkalinity, I think it's like 107 is what it reads at.
If there's any questions about anything as I'm talking, raise a hand, shout out. I don't mind. Okay. Want to make sure you're following along. So when it comes to the typical water questions that I get, people asking me, what should I do with my brewing water? How should I adjust it? I ask for their water report. What's the water that you're brewing with? And especially for people around the Great Lakes, they'll often send me a water report that's from a surface water source, Mississippi River, Lake Michigan, Lake Huron, whatever. And all of these surface water sources that are fed by precipitation are very low mineral, okay? All the mineral concentrations are like 20 ppm, which is low. It's almost like distilled water. There's really no effect that it's going to have on your beer. So, yeah, like minimal seasoning, minimal effect on the grain bill as far as establishing mash pH. If you're brewing with a groundwater source, on the other hand, from a well, from an aquifer, then because of the limestone deposits all over the Midwest, yes, you will have significant alkalinity. Poor suckers up in Madison, Wisconsin, they've got alkalinity of like 325, which is crazy, unbrewable in my opinion. Okay. So that's when that's when you have to just turn to reverse osmosis and other ion exchange methods to make that water brewable. But for alkalinity of 100, you can work with that. Here in LA, in the Los Angeles County area, we're fed by local aquifers and water from up north. And our alkalinity is about 120, 130, something like that. And that brews a great brown ale or other porter. And so, and that brings us, to the third point on what you need to know simple things, what you need to know to understand brewing water adjustment. And that is the brew cube on page 364 of the current edition of How to Brew. How many people do not have the current edition of How to Brew?
Was that in your earlier editions as well?
No, it's only in the latest edition.
I don't have it to show, unfortunately. Can we broadcast that? Is that
Yeah. In fact, I can probably share screen if that would help.
Yeah,
I'll give you a quick tutorial on it.
Sure thing. I just gave you a co-host capability.
Okay, let me find it and I'll pull it up. Come on. There we go. Where is it? Huh. Well, where is it? This will work. Okay, share screen. Okay, you see this right here?
Yep.
Okay, let me see if I can zoom in on it a little bit. Is that more visible?
Yeah, that's good.
Okay, so the brew cube is something I came up with, I don't know, 2014, 15, something like that. I was trying to talk to this Greek brewing club in Athens. And what it is you define a beer style by 3 parameters. You define that beer style by its color, pale, amber, or dark. You define that beer style by its flavor balance. Is it a malty, balanced, or hoppy style? And by its beer structure, soft, medium, or firm. Okay, now structure. What is structure? Well, it's in essence the amount of seasoning that is supporting the flavors of the beer. It's the amount of minerals in the water that are supporting the flavors of the beer. Light seasoning versus heavy seasoning, French cooking versus Cajun cooking, if you will. So most beer styles are in the soft and medium structure categories. Only 2 styles are in the firm, and that would be Burton Ales from Burton-on-Trent and Dortmunder Export. Those would be the only 2 firm styles I can think of. Everything else is soft or medium. Kolsch, soft. Bohemian Pilsner, soft. Extra special bitter, medium. You know, American Pale Ale, medium. So you define your beer style in that way, and those beer style parameters correspond to 3 water parameters. Structure corresponds to the calcium content of the water or of the water that you build. So a soft beer should have 50 calcium, roughly, is a thumb number. Medium structure should have calcium of 100 ppm. A pale beer, pale, amber, dark, pale beer should have a negative residual alkalinity. Now, residual alkalinity is the balance of hardness to alkalinity in the water. And the more alkalinity that you have in the water, the darker the beer style needs to be to balance it. Because we're always looking for that 5.2 to 5.6 mash pH range for good enzyme conversion and good wort flavor and good beer pH characteristics. So 5.2 to 5.6 is our range. A pale beer with, base malt only is typically going to have a mash pH of about 5.8 to 6. So you want negative residual alkalinity, more hardness than alkalinity to help that mash pH come down to our 5.2 to 5.6 range. An amber beer can have, it has some specialty malt that supplies some acidity to the mash. It can have a residual alkalinity of 0 or near 0. That in other words, the specialty malts balance and overbalance the 0 residual alkalinity and help pull us from 5.8 down to the 5.2 to 5.6 range. In the case of dark beer grists, where you have, more specialty malts such as caramel and roast malts, there's quite a bit of acidity in that grain bill. The more alkalinity than hardness helps balance the acidity of the specialty malts and helps us maintain that 5.2 to 5.6 range. Okay. And then once you've done that, you look at which calcium salt you're adding to your water. And if you're making an IPA, well, then you use gypsum, you use calcium sulfate and bump up that the sulfate to give it a hoppier character. It accentuates the hoppiness of the style. If it's a maltier style that you're brewing, such as Munich Dunkel or American Amber Ale, or maybe it's a balanced style, then you would also add some calcium chloride. Okay, and those sulfate to chloride ratios, and these are just suggestions and just in general. Sulfate heavy is hoppy, chloride heavy is malty. Near 1-to-1, and this could be like anywhere from 100 ppm to 75 ppm. It's not exactly 1-to-1, but it's close. That would still be a fairly balanced profile. Okay, so, and this kind of feeds into one of the other water questions on the sanctity of classic brewing cities. And there really isn't any sanctity there. Classic brewing cities and the beers that they created are guidelines, because brewers have always adjusted brewing water to suit the beer. We're brewing, a professional brewer is brewing that beer every week. And so they're saying, what can we do to make this beer taste better? They're adjusting malts, they're adjusting their water, and I don't care if it was 500 years ago, they were looking at different water sources, looking at filtering the water, looking at adding some quicklime or some other, natural chemicals that they knew had an effect on their food. Brewers were not brewing in a vacuum. They knew their world. They knew from their mothers and their grandfathers that, yeah, if you add some of this is what it tastes, what it changes the taste. So yeah, brewers have been adjusting brewing water for hundreds and hundreds of years. Now stop there so people can ask questions.
It's just going to cry false because I think you snuck in some of those fancy science words. But no, I appreciate that. And, John, I got to tell you, like, one of the things that has always kind of drawn me to listening to you or reading to you is a lot of the cooking analogies that you use. I remember one in particular where you're kind of talking about a tomato sauce and the brightness and the acidity in that. And like those analogies really help kind of drive those points home when you're talking about water, which as another joke I've heard somebody say is sometimes a little dry, in terms
yes,
of topic, right? So no, I definitely can relate and appreciate those.
Good.
Yeah, does anyone have any questions? There's no restrictions here on the mute feature or anything like that. You can shout out a question. It's a small enough group, or you can throw it into the chat. John, if you want to throw down your screen share, I think you'd be okay there too.
Oh yeah, let's see.
Although we like this, thank you. That was very
Well-
convenient.
Well, actually, I think it was an excellent question, and then the answer was fantastic. So I actually understood what you were saying, John.
Oh,
So
good.
appreciate that.
Good. Yeah. So that's on page 364 of the new edition of How to Brew. And if you don't have the current edition, I really do encourage you to get it because 200 more pages of material went into this. Everything I have learned over the last 10 years, from the previous edition, I added in here.
Is
So,
there, for a good segue here, is there anything in there about pastry stouts or hazy IPAs? I'm just curious to get your
those
take on some
two,
of those.
I missed the boat on those two styles. When it launched in 2017, they asked me to come up with a hazy IPA recipe as bonus material for early orders. And so I created a recipe. I had never had one at that point. I had heard about them. And I think actually I had one in South America. One of the homebrewers there in Brazil gave me one of his to try, or a commercial one that they had imported. And I just remember this like half-inch slug of yeast on the bottom of the glass. But I came up with the recipe and then I thought, well, I better brew it because HomebrewCon's, in a couple of weeks, I better know what it tastes like. And I really liked it. I was surprised. I liked it a lot. But yeah, hazy IPAs were new. Pastry stouts were new. What was I was doing just last week? I was doing a program with who? Oh, I was on the session with the Brewing Network. And they said to have a beer. So I had a pastry stout that was a collaboration brew with some friends of mine in Bogota, Colombia. We did a collaboration brew there a year or two ago and soured a pastry stout in a Jack Daniel's barrel that they had imported. And it was
And that
about a
sounds
year.
interesting. I like
Yeah.
that. That sounds really interesting.
It was very nice. They sent a few bottles up with a friend of theirs that was traveling to the States, and I met him down in LA and picked him up. And the beer itself was like a heavy imperial pastry stout, and sweet, but it dried out in the barrel, and as a sour, very nice sour. So that's a style I'm tempted to brew again sometime.
I got a
And would you
question.
say that? Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. What do you think the biggest change to beer styles and homebrewing has been in the last 5 years?
I think it's the introduction of these new yeasts. Pastry stout, in a great many ways is really nothing more than a poorly designed homebrew recipe where it's too unbalanced. It's very sweet. But when you combine some of these these styles with the new yeasts that are coming out, with the Kveik yeast from Norway, with the Philly sour yeast from Lallemand, and some of these new souring yeasts, there's a lot of potential for really, anytime you change a yeast type, you have changed the style. And so when you start brewing imperial stout or hazy IPA with Kveik, that's a new style, and often I've brewed it with Kveik yeast several times in the last 2 years. And I mean, I still call them kind of like the base grain bill style, like Munich Dunkel or IPA. But given my brewing conditions here in Southern California, my wife made me give up my fermentation fridge. So it's like, okay, I'll just brew in the garage. Most of the time the temperature here is pretty stable. During the winter, it'll be, you know, pretty steady 60, 65 in the garage. And then of course, immediately after you brew, it jumps up to 90. Well, at one point, the first time I brewed my Munich Dunkel, I used Fermentus 3470, which is a really bulletproof yeast. I really like that yeast. And I brewed it at 65, 70, 65, 70 degrees in the garage. Came out great, very clean, no problems. The next time I brewed it, I think it was probably in May, and we were having a heat wave. So at least when I started, it was about 90. So I thought, well, in this case, I'll use Kvike, because that'll be kind of on the low end of Kvike's temperature range. And of course, immediately after I pitched that, then we had a cool spell, dropped back down to 65. So I had to wrap a firm wrap around the fermenter. But that tricked along at 90 degrees, kept it right there at 90. And again, a very clean lager-like Munich Dunkel resulted, even though it was fermented at 90 degrees. So, you know, the yeasts we have available to us these days are big game changers. Let's see, let me look at some of the other questions here. Question number 2. My municipal water is quite hard. Haha, you may think it's hard. It is quite hard, and I have an RO system in my house. It's been suggested to me that I have a water softener installed in the house, but I know using softened water in brewing is a no-no. But if the softened water then feeds my RO system, would that RO treated water be okay to use for brewing? Okay, let's talk about water softeners and reverse osmosis. The purpose of reverse osmosis is to pull all of the minerals out of the water. Okay, you run water through a reverse osmosis filter, and all of your mineral levels will be less than 10 ppm. They may be even less than 5 ppm, but less than 10 is a good first cut. And anything less than 10 ppm is a very low concentration. It's in the noise in terms of brewing water profiles. So on the other hand, reverse osmosis systems perform better if you get the calcium out of the water, because calcium and carbonate form calcium carbonate scale. And calcium carbonate scale, just like on your plumbing, can block the membranes of the RO system. So that's why they recommend installing a water softener that will remove the calcium and magnesium from the water before you send it through the RO system. That way, you replace the calcium and magnesium with sodium, and then no calcium carbonate forms in the reverse osmosis unit, and the RO unit strips out the sodium and the alkalinity and the sulfate and everything else. Okay, you end up with near distilled water. Now, near distilled water is very boring water to brew with. It doesn't have any character. And I've judged many competitions where you'll be tasting beers and you'll say, nice aroma, you know, and you taste it and there's a very watery finish. There's just like no guts to the beer. There's no mineral structure. And this is where we go back to the brew cube with the mineral structure thing. Reverse osmosis water, no minerals, therefore no seasoning for the beer flavors. And you tend to end up with kind of a watery tasting beer, in my opinion. Now, it's a subtle effect. It's, you know, many people brew with reverse osmosis water. They make good beers, no problem. But when you're judging a competition with several beers side by side, you can tell the difference. And that's where I'm going there. Okay, so let me make sure I circle back to the original question here. Yeah, so having an RO system in your house and brewing to create brewing water is fine. You just need to know that adding calcium salts is probably recommended to help give some structure to that beer, depending on what style it is. Oh, and also when it says my municipal water is quite hard. In North America, most people's water is not actually hard. It's high alkalinity. You have water scale forming on your plumbing because you have moderate hardness, that is calcium and magnesium. You'll have, maybe 50, 60, 70 ppm. Here in Los Angeles, our water is about 70 ppm calcium, 15, 20 magnesium, something like that. And people complain about hardness, but it's the alkalinity that's like at 140 or 150. That's the problem. And unfortunately for most people, or in terms of water softening technology, it's easier and cheaper to pull out the calcium and magnesium to mitigate the calcium carbonate scale problem on your plumbing. It's easier to pull out the calcium than it is to pull out the alkalinity. But as brewers, we want the calcium and magnesium. And I'll talk more about magnesium in a few minutes. So yeah, when you soften your water, you're pulling out the good stuff and leaving all the bad stuff behind. That's why we say don't brew with softened water. It's because you left all that alkalinity there, which messes up your mash pH. So yeah, people will send me their water reports, say, oh, I've got really hard water. And I look at their calcium number and it's 20. That's low. In my opinion, you want to get your calcium levels up to at least 50. Between 50 and 100 works for almost every style. Okay. It's the alkalinity that you got to take a look at and figure out how to reduce. And the easiest way to do that is with acidification. Phosphoric acid, lactic acid, and which brings us to another doohickey. I have a water adjustment app for the iPhone and for what's the other one? Galaxy.
Samsung?
Android?
Yeah, Google. It's in both the Apple Store and the Google Play Store. That's what I meant to say.
Android.
Yeah, Android. That's the word.
This is not a plug, by the way. Just FYI.
Palmer's Brewing Water Adjustment app. It's free. It works just like my brewing water spreadsheet. And where's my phone? It's in my pocket. I don't know.
We're all loading that right now.
Yeah, good.
I watched almost everyone on this app just now just pick up their phone and like, oh wait, what?
Yeah, Palmer's Brewing Water Adjustment app. It's real easy to use. It's just kind of a step-by-step. You pick the beer style you're going to brew. You get some suggested water profiles. You put in the volume of water that you intend to treat. And if there's an instructions page that walks you through how to use it. Makes water adjustment pretty straightforward. The only thing that's different between my water app and other water apps, such as like Martin Brewingard's Brewing Water or Beersmith, is that I don't estimate mash pH. I only talk about residual alkalinity because there's a lot of factors that affect mash pH. And in my opinion, you really can't reliably predict mash pH with software at this point. We don't have a big enough database on malts and their acidities. It can be done, but at the moment we really don't have enough published data. So I just talk about, the brew cube. If you're going to brew a dark beer, then you want higher residual alkalinity. If you're going to brew a pale beer, you want lower or negative residual alkalinity. You try it a few times and it makes sense and it works. Let's see. So what else we got here? Right. How sacrosanct are the guidelines for trying to match water of classic beer locations? Not really. They're good guidelines, but if you instead, I mean, even somebody give me a classic beer style as an
Pilsner.
example. Pilsner. Okay. Pilsner, it's a pale, soft, and kind of balanced beer style. Would you agree? You can make it hoppier. You can just, adjust that sulfate to chloride ratio a little bit, this way or that. But essentially, it is a pale, balanced, soft beer style. And one illustration I use when talking about soft, medium, and firm beer structure for the brew cube is Bohemian Pilsner, German Pilsner, and Dortmunder Export. 3 styles that have essentially the same grain bill, same yeast. The difference between those 3 beer styles is, in part, is the water that they're brewed with. Bohemian Pilsner, soft, low minerals, nice. It's a bitter beer. It's a fairly big beer. 1055, 40, 30, 40 IBUs, but they're soft flavors. Okay. Whereas you go to a German Pilsner with higher mineral in the water, and it becomes a crisper beer, a little more bitter tasting because of the enhanced mineral structure. You go to Dortmunder Export. Dortmunder Export is actually a lower gravity style than both Bohemian and German Pilsner, but it doesn't taste like it because you've got the extra mineral in the water that is supporting that beer's flavors. So that's the impact of mineral structure on the beer.
Like when you describe using sulfate as enhancing happiness, that's kind of a misnomer, really, isn't it? I mean, it enhances bitterness, but it doesn't enhance like hop flavor.
That's a very good point. Yes, Jim, that's a good point. And actually, it doesn't enhance bitterness either. It just changes the perception of that bitterness on your palate. A beer that has high sulfate versus one that has low sulfate, the bitter character, the bitterness profile, when it hits your tongue, is assertive. And so it's very bitter up front, but it fades quickly. When you swallow that beer, the bitterness fades and you're ready for another sip. If the water has low sulfate, if it's like a pretty bitter American pale ale made with low sulfate water, that bitterness is going to linger on your tongue. And that bitterness is going to accumulate as you drink the beer. So higher sulfate enhances the bitterness, makes that bitterness more assertive, but also makes it fade faster from your palate. Chloride, on the other hand, and it's half of sodium chloride, and sodium works the same way. When you add salt, table salt, to your beer, to your food, it enhances the sweetness of the grain, of the maltiness. So it makes that beer taste a little rounder, fuller, and sweeter. But it, like I say, it's just a seasoning effect. It's not creating flavors. And when you add sulfate to water, you're not creating flavors, you're just enhancing what's there.
Right. And yeah, I think a lot of people, get the wrong, perception, thinking that, if I'm making an IPA, I need to throw, a shit ton of sulfate in the water.
Right.
And, then you get this astringent,
Yeah.
hop.
I'm glad you brought that up, because that is a good point to make. Definitely.
Okay.
right, leading things along here. What's your take on decoction? We had Charlie Bamforth on, and
Yeah.
he kind of thought, he's like, I don't know if it's really necessary, and he kind of gave us that take on it. And we've had a couple of pro brewers in the mix here as well, and they swear by it in other instances too. And yeah, I'd just be curious to hear what you think.
Yeah. Well, for me, and it says it in addition, beer and brewing is food and cooking. Okay, so you have to understand why decoction was invented. Decoction was invented 500 years ago, roughly, before we had thermometers, before we had easy access to stainless steel tanks, because stainless steel really wasn't commercially available until 1950. And so the way that the Germans and the Europeans brewed back then was that they had a copper or brass kettle. That was their boiling kettle. The mash tun was a wooden tub. And so they would heat hot water in their kettle, pour that into the wooden tub, and they would, because these, metal was expensive, they would heat several batches of water to fill that tub, that wooden tub, and put their grain in it for the mash. Now, what they would do, and this was trial and error. It was a result of the state of barley at the time. Barley back then was less enzymatic than it is now. We've been breeding barley for brewing for 1,000 years now, at least, if maybe not 2,000. Brewing itself goes back 9,000 years, almost 10,000. But we, in terms of dedicated agronomy, we've only been working on barley for a millennia or two. So they determined empirically that if they took out a third of that mash as dry grain, or near, they'd scoop out, drain off the water, just pour in the grain and put that in the kettle and heat it up to a boil and pour it back in and do that 3 times, they would get up to a range where, hey, the wort cleared and it tasted sweet. Hey, it's ready to boil. We can, and so, decoction mashing, it had the, as a method, they could judge temperatures without a thermometer, because they would dough in when the water was just like hot to the touch. They would pull a third, put it back in, pull a third, put it back in, pull a third, put it back in. That seemed to be the right temperature for the water, for the grist to convert and become sweeter. And it also, the action of the boil broke up the protein carbohydrate matrix in the endosperm of the malt and released those starches better to the enzymes. So decoction mashing had the advantages of better efficiency, better extraction from their barley, as well as a way to gauge the progress of the mash as they went. And that's how decoction was created. So you move to today with highly enzymatic malts that are well modified. They don't have any problem making those starches available to the enzymes. Single temperature infusion mash gets the job done. And today's malts are twice as diastatic as malts were, 200, 300, 500 years ago. So mashes don't have to last so long. In fact, modern malts really mash themselves within about half an hour. We still do an hour mash because it really doesn't hurt anything, and it works. Hour's not a big deal. So yeah, I don't think decoction mashing really is accomplishing anything unless you are going to brew a traditional German beer without using specialty malts. Because the other aspect of a decoction mash is that boiling of the grain darkens the wort, extracts this deeper maltiness. So that's how you brew, Dunkels and other darker styles, is using the boiling action of the decoction to darken the wort and create these maltier flavors within the absence of today's specialty malts that contribute them, for it.
So this wasn't my question. And I really want to play devil's advocate with this. So bear with me here.
Sure.
I am not a beer judge. I am not even close. And, but I do love to taste me some beer.
Mhm.
But I don't think I could taste the difference between a decocted beer and an undecocted beer. And again, there are other people that can. I mean, I've seen it. And so like, I know it exists, but I mean, are you able to pick any of that up? Is there anything that, does it change something in the mouthfeel to you? Like, what can you tell me kind of about that?
I can't say, I have not done any side-by-side tastings, same brewers, same grain bill, just different, methods, different mashes, to say that definitively. Quaff, the homebrew club in San Diego, though, did a side-by-side club event with Weizen. And they actually preferred, as a club in blind tasting, the single mash infusion beer with a little bit of specialty malt. They thought that had a brighter, cleaner flavor in their Weiss beer than the triple decoction. So yeah, decoction, great fun, but its flavors can be easily replicated. If it's not exactly the same, but it's 98% the same, and close enough is good enough, and sometimes better in the palates of many people. So I've done decoctions. I've done them, to adjust my mash temperatures when things don't work out right. I've done them for fun, just to say I'm gonna do a decoction mash dunkel or something. But yeah, modern specialty malts will supply a lot of those characters for you. I can see Sylvia has her hand up.
That might be an educational topic that we would pursue. We have a couple of members that swear that decoction is the only way to go, and I think the scientific method would suggest that we put it to a test and find out what we got.
Yeah, I feel like we need to bring in the Brewlosophy boys to pull something like that off.
Yeah. And actually, if you look that up on Brewlosophy, you'll find a couple of cases that they've done. Danny Kahn, of course, has done some experiments along those lines, and he feels that decoction doesn't really add anything, flavor wise. Or
you're being very kind. I think Denny's words were overrated, but
yeah. But no, it's decoction is fun as a technique, and it's nice to know why it works and how it works. But yeah, we have so many interesting specialty malts these days that it's really not needed. And even in Germany, you really don't find traditional decoction used anymore because it's so energy intensive.
Yep. It's very true. Let's see.
I noticed a couple people were drinking some fancy older beers tonight. I saw a couple of bourbon counties and a KBS here and there. What's your take on aging beers? There's another nice one.
Yeah,
too,
that's good. Yeah.
From the Coleman Brown, that's a classic too.
Oh yeah.
Look at this. Everybody's
First ones.
flashing their stash here. I love it. I love it.
Hey,
Um,
Oh
Eric,
yeah, Masted.
so on the aging beer front, what's your take on aging beers? Do you have recommendations or
Yeah.
certain techniques? What do you got for us there?
Aging is a very interesting topic. I was talking with Charlie Bamforth about this a couple months ago for a paper I was doing. Aging and oxidation, they go hand in hand. Total package oxygen is the dominant factor when it comes to age, staling of a beer, shelf instability of a beer. Now, that being said, the kind of beer that you're aging makes a huge difference. A Kolsch aged is going to taste like crap. It's going to be very stale tasting, very papery, just no fun to drink. A amber ale, like a heavy amber ales, 1060, lots of caramel malt, could be a little more interesting. It's going to take on some oxidized ester, some plum and prune flavors that, as high esterification of higher alcohols that could be interesting. And so to get to my point, the kind of beer that you're aging makes a huge difference. Generally, aging only benefits heavier beers, higher alcohol beers with lots of flavor compounds, because there you have enough flavor compounds where some can oxidize and transform into more interesting compounds to mask a lot of the oxidation compounds, the staling compounds, as you would otherwise perceive. So, it's easier for a heavier, darker beer to become interesting with aging than it is for pale beer. And even barley wines, imperial stouts, Baltic porters, I really would not recommend aging them past a year. I don't think that in general beers improve with age, because all of these reactions are in effect oxidation, staling reactions. And for a while there, you'll get some new characters appearing that you interpret as fruity and interesting, but over time, it just becomes less bitter, sweeter, more prune-like, I guess, is one descriptor.
Well, we did have the opportunity to sample a 27-year-old Russian Imperial Stout.
Oh,
And it was one that had won the nationals as in the stout category way back in 1992. And it was surprisingly good. There was still some carbonation in it. The character that was lost were the volatile hop character, replaced by the oxidative, as you mentioned, like fruity,
molasses,
winey
yeah,
sorts of notes.
Mm-hmm.
And we had the last three bottles. The board of directors sampled that at one of our meetings, and I would say that it was surprising how good it was, and that we've had others that wouldn't match that when they were only a couple of years old. But 27 years, I think is the oldest of a beer that I've ever had.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think subjectively, when you know that you're tasting a long aged beer, you're tasting it with that,
Yeah.
kind of
adjusting,
handicap.
right.
Yeah. You're saying, okay, yeah, this is really good for a really old beer. I think, with in a year, in maybe two, depending on how heavy that style is, yeah, it will get more interesting, and then start declining where you're saying it's not bad, rather than it's really good.
Yeah.
I've heard people joke that a double APA 2 years later is a barley wine.
Yeah, that can certainly be the case. Or you be kind and call it a Belgian,
You
cover all the
are far
bases.
off, Brian. I'm with you there.
Yeah.
Well, there are some beers, one in particular, I know everyone here will know, is Three Floyds does that Dark Lord every year.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Okay, now that beer is almost undrinkable when it's made the first year. You nearly would need to wait 5 years before that becomes consumable at all. So, I mean, that's kind of like,
Yeah. That's one where, you're working that recipe and waiting for those harsher notes to mellow out, and for those, and they're probably brewing it hot, and you're waiting for those fusels to esterify and get interesting. So yeah, I mean, you can create beers, and there are certainly many sour styles that benefit from aging, for that reason. Orval is another one where, you let that Britannices character develop over time. That makes it more interesting. But, for most modern ales and lagers, aging is not your friend.
agree.
So
Yeah,
John,
that
question for you.
Britannices, right?
Question for you.
Yes.
One of my favorite books is the Brewing Classic
yeah.
Styles book that I know you wrote with Jamil. First question, were any of the recipes yours, or were they all Jamil's?
Those are all Jamil's recipes. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
I wrote the beginning, the front matter, and I wrote the back matter.
Yeah, that's where I first started doing. I've been doing partial mashes, and that was where my first introduction to it. But I guess, in general, what did you think about this book when you were writing it? When you and Jamil were writing it, and what were you trying to do with this necessarily? What was your intention?
Well, my intention was simply to make, I wanted to make how to brew with malt extract, because after I did how to brew, some of the feedback that I got from brew shop owners was, great book, but you're moving everybody to whole grain too soon. We make all our money, we make all our margin on extract kits. And I was like, oh, okay, well, I'll try to write a book on how to brew with malt extract, because, hey, keeping brew shops afloat is important. And so I was at GABF. What year was that? I guess it would have been 2000. Well, it would have been, I guess it would have been 2007 when that edition of How to Brew came out, and Jamil was there. And I was telling him that, yeah, I want to write a book on how to brew with malt extract. And I said, I need some killer recipes, and I know you make killer recipes. And he said, oh yeah, I've got a gold-winning recipe in every style. And I said, oh really? That's very interesting. That's a good hook. And so we started talking, and that's how Brewing Classic Styles came out. It was I was looking through one of my folders the other day, and I came upon the original title of the book. I think the original title was Brewing with Style. But yeah, Jamil said, hey, I've got a winning recipe in every style. He was doing the style column for BYO at the time. And so I laid out the organization of the book, and, the chapters on, how to brew. And then he filled in all of the recipe chapters.
Yeah, at least the thing I really like about it is that regardless of how you're brewing your beer, if it's extract, partial mash, or all grain, it just gives you a good starting point for looking at a quality recipe right from the start and deciding whether you want to brew it exactly like that, or do you want to use that as a jumping off point to something else.
Right. And I used Brewing Classic Styles as a basis for my recipes for years. Look what he did, and then branch off from there.
Thank you.
Sure. I noticed one of the questions was about Britannomyces.
Yes.
Where is that one? What are your thoughts on Britannomyces and the notion that this was probably the yeast of early beers? That is a common thought. But as you guys know, you can easily tell the difference between an ale brewed with Saccharomyces and an ale brewed with Britannomyces. They taste different. And so that was readily apparent to early brewers as well. Now, Britain, for which Britannomyces is named, I guess to lay out a little bit of history here. So beer spoilage has always been a problem, because, you would brew the beer and then you had some amount of time for consumption before it started to go sour because of, lack of understanding of pasteurization and storage and cold temperatures, night houses, and blah, blah, blah.
These are just ingredients.
The way that brewers handled beer spoilage was three ways. One, they hopped the hell out of it like the British, or two, they kept it cold like the Germans, or three, they spoiled it first like the Belgians did. So Britannomyces was known, and Britannomyces was, would get into the kegs, and over time it would, turn the beer. Now, in the case of British Porter, that was a desired effect, because the Britannomyces, just like in the beer Orval, which is the really only surviving example of British Burton ale brewed in, Belgium. That is an example of those early, pale ales where, base malt, pale malt, lots of hops, aged in barrels with Britannomyces, and over time, that Britannomyces continues to ferment the dextrins in that beer, and the beer takes on a little different character. And so in the case of British Porter, they again did lots of barrel aging. They did aging in giant wooden vats, that were the size of a building. That Britannomyces, that little drier character and that little funkiness that became a characteristic of the beer. Did all beers have Britannomyces? No. Some did, some didn't. Some beers were intentionally served early to avoid Britannomyces. Others were intentionally aged to encourage it. Stock ale was one where the beer was aged in casks to, and take on that Brett character. I am not a real expert on this. I'm regurgitating the points that I remember from talking with experts such as Rob Pattinson and Kristen England and several others that, and Gordon Strong, that really care about this stuff. My interest in brewing is really the mash, the chemistry of what's going on in the brewing process. Once fermentation happens, it's like, okay, yeah, it's fine to, go drink it. I'm going to make another one.
I think we all fall into that sometimes. Like once it's done, then we're like, yeah, we're going to drink that and we're going to make the next one. Here we go.
Yep.
I like it.
My other hobby is bladesmithing, and I have a forge out back, and I make Damascus steels and different things. And I don't know, I've probably made 20, 30, 40 knives in the last 10 years, but only finished like 5.
How soon do we see you on Forged in Fire?
I don't know. I would love to do it. I seriously would love to do it, but I don't know that I have the stamina for it. I can only last in my forge about 2 hours before I'm just overheated and it's time to get out. Whereas you got to survive 3 hours in a hot studio there. Yeah, I don't know how I do, but I've made some cool things. It's going to be hard to, let me turn off my virtual background here a second.
I was thinking that was your hop crop behind you, a real one.
Yeah, that was a picture I took several years ago.
Great big buds.
Yeah. Here's a knife that I made.
Oh.
And
I forget what they call that shape, but they have it all the time in that show.
Yeah, it's a kukri.
Okay, that's it.
Yeah. Yeah. This is probably my nicest one. It took extra care in the handle, but you make things and I often don't finish them. Here's a cable Damascus knife. And it's going to be really hard to show the grain structure. There, you can see the grain structure a little bit.
Yeah.
Oh,
Very
yeah.
cool.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. This is made from steel cable.
Wow.
It gives that pattern. But, just fun stuff. But yeah, I rarely get around to actually finishing putting handles on them. It's just, it's the forging of the billet and the shaping the blade and that I enjoy. Same with the mashing process. I love making the mash and making the wort, and then, I'll get around, I ferment it, and then I leave it in the fridge for months.
So when's the knife making book coming out? Is that or is that going straight on? Is that going straight online or?
Yeah. I really don't have time these days to write as much as I would like to. I've thought about it, but there's some good books on knife making, and of course everything's on YouTube these days. My day job these days is writing or editing for the Master Brewers Association. So I do the journal. I field manuscripts that come in, edit them, review them, send them out for comments and so on. And that's most of my week, along with the books that the Master Brewers Association publishes. We're doing a really interesting book right now. I'm working with Dr. Greg Casey, formerly of Coors. He invented the fishbone diagrams, or not invent them, but he really worked with those fishbone diagrams for Coors. He is writing a book called The Inspiring History of American Adjunct Lager Beer. And what's really fascinating is that adjunct lager beer was not invented in the United States. It was invented in Germany in 1850, thereabouts. German brewers emigrated to the United States in the mid 1800s because of the restrictive government, if you will, of Germany at the time. It was, there were strict guilds and guild requirements that wouldn't allow you to open a brewery unless you were of sufficient standing and so on. So lots of German brewers immigrated to the New World, both North and South America, to open their own breweries, and they brought adjunct lager brewing with them. And I won't bore you with this. At least I'll try not to. But yeah, adjunct lager beer became very popular in the United States around 1870 and was the dominant style of beer in the United States by 1900. And so by the time Prohibition rolled around, it was the beer of the land. And post-Prohibition, it was it was reinstated, being brewed at almost exactly the same specification as it had been prior to Prohibition. Greg Casey is publishing 3 books that describe the history of American light lager, and all the science that went into it. American brewers were highly respected throughout the world, which I think is really cool. There's just so many interesting facts that have come out from his research, that we were respected because we could brew a clear beer. We were the country that liked ice and ice cold beverages. And so we had this cosmetic problem with our beer that we strove to address with light lager and adjunct lager. And we wanted that beer to be clear when it was cold. And that was admired in the rest of the world. So if you look at records from the World Expo in Brooklyn and so on, turn of the century in Paris and so on, when Pabst was, the #1 beer in the world, part of that was because it was clear when it was cold. Fascinating stuff. So that's what I do when I'm not talking with you guys.
Hey, John, have cold IPAs made their way out to you yet?
No. And next week, I intend to watch a webinar about that very subject.
Okay.
I've heard about them. I don't really know what they are, or why they're different.
We're hearing it's more of a marketing ploy.
The thought is it's just an IPL.
Yeah.
Being rebranded as cold brew IPA to sell more cups.
Yeah, that could be. I've never been a fan of IPLs. Somehow noble hops and dry hopping and lots of noble hops just doesn't work out, because a lot of those original landrace hops just have more sulfur character to them. And when people have given me IPLs in the past, it's just this very sulfury beer that I didn't care for. Anyway, I'm looking forward to this webinar because it's something new for me. When it comes to my personal taste in beer, I'm old school. My favorite hop is Cascade. Second favorite is Centennial. I like West Coast IPAs. I do like hazy IPAs sometimes, but so many of the modern hops, Mosaic and the New Zealand hops, are just too fruity for me. I came from a time when, a very fruity beer was poor fermentation temperature control, bad homebrew. So, a lot of the flavors that are currently popular in beer just don't excite me at all. And like I said, I like dark beer. I like Munich Dunkel, one of my favorite styles. West Coast IPA is another one of my favorite styles. Do lots of pale ales, and never been keen on German Hefeweizen because of the phenolics. Same with the Belgian styles, Belgian pale ale. I'm just not keen on phenolics because to me, that's bad homebrew, poor fermentation management. Just, the way I started homebrewing.
We've had many discussions, the boss board, about dealing with the proliferation of styles, and particularly the brewers becoming, and to me, enamored with their challenge to their creativity. So they're going to go overboard and come up with something that nobody else has ever done. Bring on the Cocoa Puffs, you know, and that start craving the traditional styles. And when we talk to our friends who are professional brewers, they say, well, you know, we have to admit that the reality is that there are people that come in and they taste some of these, be it a pastry, stout, or a hazy, whatever, and they say, wow, this is great. It doesn't even taste like beer. Bring me another one. And they look at the turnover of their product, and these are going out much faster than the traditional. And we as a club try our damnedest to drink all of the traditional beers. We can't keep up with that. I guess we need to convince others to get into that. It seems to me that part of it is it's comparable to, like in wines, the beginning wine drinkers like something that is sweet. Drinking something that's dry takes some work, I suppose, and a commitment to get to the point where you can master the tannins and you can master the dryness and the puckering, but start looking at how that matches with various food, and you have that symbiotic relationship between the food and the beverage, making both taste even better. And my contention is that that's what we're dealing with right now. And, I don't know what happens. There are too many styles being developed. We look at GABF, and for that matter, even the any competition, how many more styles can be introduced? And I don't want to be the only curmudgeon in the club that says we don't need all of these. You know, why don't we, when we do a competition, why don't we lump all of the pale ales into one category, and we select the best of those? But anyway, thoughts on that?
Yeah, seen the meme of evolution of man, where it starts as a monkey and goes up.
And the beard growing longer too.
And they've seen a similar one for evolution of beer drinkers. It goes the lagers and the IPAs, the stouts, pastry stouts, and then sours, and back to lagers.
I mean, I do mention this in the book, where, you know, that evolution of the home brewer from first good beer to strong to spiced to sour, you know, and exotic and so on, and then back to classic style. And you see that with professional breweries. You see it with a GBF. I know from all my years going to GABF, you know, you walk around, you try some interesting beers, some cocoa, you know, chocolate beers and pastry stouts and imperial stouts and imperial sour stouts and so on. And everybody, and Dogfish Head is a prime example. You know, Sam would make some really interesting beers, and, you know, you're drinking 1 ounce, but could I drink an entire pint of that?
Right.
No. It's interesting to taste, and I'll finish that little glass, but I am not going to drink an entire pint of this super sweet or super sour or super whatever they made. I mean, it is interesting though.
And you're probably not going to buy a 6-pack of it either.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Midas Touch wasn't too bad, but there, you know, a lot of the other ones were just kind of strange. And what was always interesting to me is where, you know, you'd walk around GABF and you'd see a bunch of your friends, you know, in other words, a bunch of the notable brewers like Vinny, Jamil, you know, Matt Brynildson and others at the back of a booth, and they're drinking some dude's Pilsner. You know, There's like, oh yeah, you got to try this. This is really good. You know, it was because, you know, we as experienced brewers and experienced bill drinkers can recognize the quality, the level of quality in some of these lighter classic styles. Yeah, these other styles are really interesting, and Hazy's was, you know, that avant-garde beer for quite a while. They've kind of been focused and toned down since then. So now they are a legit style all their own, and there are still good ones and bad ones out there. But yeah, a good hazy is a delicious beer, and occasionally I'll have them. Same with brut IPAs. Harder to pull off. I've only had a couple of really good ones, and actually the couple of really good ones I had were from Mexico. They had suited their climate, and those were quite nice. But yeah, drinkability, very important when it comes to beer, and really that is part of the story of American light lager. Pre-prohibition, you know, 1800, up to 1850, yeah, you had all these local brewers brewing different styles. But when American adjunct lager started hitting the scene, it was favored. It was a more drinkable beer than the other styles, and it's what people wanted. And that's, and Greg in his book, he bemoans the fact that, you know, people say that the United States doesn't have a beer brewing tradition of its own. Yes, we do. American light lager. It is 90% of the beer brewed in the world today. Now, the United States is also the source of the craft brewing movement, which is the other half of the other side of the coin. I go down to South America, at least pre-COVID. I'll go down there 5, 6, 7 times a year. I think my record is 9. Down to Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, Uruguay, Ecuador. They are really interested in what the Americans are brewing. They want to know what we're doing next. They're brewing West Coast IPAs. They're brewing hazy IPAs. They've embraced Berliner Weiss with fruit, which is become known as Catalina Sour. What else are they making down there? Sour IPAs. I've had some really good sour IPAs down there. Again, in kind of this Berliner Weiss kind of souring, kettle souring style. So yeah, they're really interested in what the United States is doing. The United States really has a very strong brewing tradition. We're not used to looking at ourselves that way. We're used to looking to the Belgians and the Germans and the British, but really the melting pot holds. We've taken what the other countries have done and improved on it.
Mhm.
John, what do you think about homebrewing in general in terms of like the industry and the number of homebrewers out there? It seems like it's been dropping now for a few years.
Yeah, well, you know, I think I got into homebrewing because I couldn't buy the beers that I wanted to drink. It was easier and faster to make them myself. These days, any style that you want to brew, that you would want to drink, you can pretty much buy. Go over to Whole Foods, go over to your local bottle shop, it's there. You know, and everybody lives within, you know, 10, 20 minutes of a local brewery these days. So that's great. So what we're seeing, I think, is a shift away from the number of people that are brewing, you know, in the early 90s, because now beer is more readily available. The only people home brewing these days are the real creative types that want to make it themselves. just like, there's the woodworkers, there's the gourmet foods, the, chefs, the bakers, every craft has its group of people that are passionate about that craft and are interested in doing themselves rather than buying it. And it's the same with home brewing. I only brew once or twice a year these days. I've been brewing more this past year than in the previous 5 years because beer is so readily available. I just grab whatever I want from the grocery store.
Do you think it's do you think we're going to be leveling off here, or do you think it's going to keep going down? Or I don't know, what's your insight for the future?
I think it's going to kind of level off, but at the same time, technology is going to make it more approachable. I mean, think in terms of computer technology, where 25 years ago, the people using personal computers were the elite. They were the people that would use computers at work. And, nowadays you've got everybody and their daughter doing, posting on the internet and TikTok and all these other, channels, YouTube videos and so on. I mean, the technology of brewing, for example, the all-in-one systems is going to make home brewing much more accessible to people. And the internet has had such a huge effect on so many technologies like that. So I think, you're going to see a leveling off of home brewing. You're not, because of the general availability of beer, but at the same time, you're going to have so much better access to technology, both, in terms of brewing hardware and brewing knowledge, that I think it will sustain. I think you'll see home brewing become pretty mainstream in the next 20 years. Winemaking too, for that, and distilling for that matter. I've never been interested in distilling. I mean, lightly interested from a technology point of view, but for me, it's only beer. I've never made mead. Now I made cider once, and that was it. That was 30 years ago. For me, I like beer, and that's what I'm interested in.
All right, I have a question.
Okay.
So you talked about, and you have talked about the pH in the mash being very important.
Yeah.
Should we as homebrewers be concerned at all with the pH in the boil, especially late in the boil? And if so, how and why?
In general, let's see. Let me start again. pH in brewing is important. And I say that this is part of my water classes that I give to commercial brewers as well as advanced homebrewers. Is pH is one of your best ways to monitor the performance of your brew. You can track pH changing throughout the brewing process. So you start out in the mash at 5.2 to 5.6. At the end of during the mash, calcium reacts with malt phosphates that releases hydrogen ions, which helps lower the mash pH. So the mash pH continues to decrease during the mash over that hour. It depends on how much calcium you have available, but yes, it will tend to decrease if you have sufficient calcium. So you may start out at, say, 5.4 at the beginning of the mash, and you could finish at 5.2 at the end of the mash. Going into the boil, during the boil, you have protein coagulation, you have volatilization, you have concentration, lots of chemistry going on during the boil. pH tends to drop up to about 0.3. So say from 5.2 down to 4.9. Go into fermentation. Fermentation, the yeast are taking in amino acids. They're, there's during the boil, you also have alpha acids going into solution, but yeast take in amino acids, they excrete organic acids and protons. pH tends to drop by about another half during fermentation. So this is how we get from our mash pH of 5.2 to 5.6 down to our final beer pH of about 4.2 to 4.6. That's the typical range for most beers. Can be as low as 4, could be even lower if it's a sour, but 4.2 to 4.6 is kind of the typical range. So to your question, Bill, is wort pH in the boil important? Yes, but if you've done everything right, you shouldn't have to worry about it. It should kind of progress. And what is important is your final beer pH, because your final beer pH is what controls the expression of flavors of the beer to your palate. And this is where my spaghetti sauce example comes in. Every beer has an optimum beer pH where all of that beer's flavors are best expressed to the palate. And if you look at spaghetti sauce, you have your store-bought ragu. It's sweet, it's tomatoey, it's good. The kids love it. Not an adult's favorite spaghetti sauce. It's okay. Whereas if you go to your local organic paleo Italian restaurant where the tomatoes were fresh picked that morning and then gently squeezed into the kettle by nuns, to create the marinara sauce, that could be a very bright, tomatoey, acidic marinara sauce that just you can feel peeling the enamel from your teeth. Not the best spaghetti sauce either. What is better is a compromise of those two extremes, something that has lots of tomato brightness, but also some depth and richness and sweetness to it. Same with your beer. You don't want that beer pH to be too low, too acidic, less than 4, because then when lower pH in beer tends to attenuate and focus flavors. Higher beer pH in beer, greater than 4.6, tends to open up and broaden flavors into mushiness. I've done several experiments over the years. Did a good one back in Denver in 2007, I think it was. Brewed 2 styles of beer, pale ale and stout, with 2 different waters, and switched them. And so we had 4 beers to taste. We had a pale ale that was brewed with a high or low residual alkalinity water, and we had a pale ale brewed with a high residual alkalinity water. Same with a stout, low residual alkalinity water, high residual alkalinity water. The pale ale brewed with the high residual alkalinity water was a common pale ale, very bitter. You could, lots of hop resin on your tongue. People liked it, and it's like, yeah, this is my pale ale. Then you tried the pale ale with the low residual alkalinity water, low RA. And that was a brighter, yet less lingering flavor. It was better balanced, and I prefer that one. Interesting thing was, half of the audience preferred the first one, half preferred the second one. In the case of the stout, brewed with the low alkalinity water, it was a good stout, had a very clean, roasty character. But when you tried the stout brewed with the higher alkalinity water, you got a lot more malt flavor coming through. That little higher pH helped open up the malt flavors. You could taste the half pound of smoked malt that I had included. You could taste this chocolate. You could taste the caramel malts. They were all part of that grain bill. It was a more complex beer, and the little higher alkalinity, or the higher pH, I should say, the little higher pH of that final beer, we're talking about 2 pH points, 4.4 versus 4.6 or something like that. That opened up the flavors of that stout. So that's the effect of final beer pH on beer flavor. It could either attenuate them or it can kind of open them up, and it's a subtle effect, but very real. And Brewlosophy has done some experiments along this lines too, and they've, it's been statistically significant with them as well.
Yeah.
So that's, yeah, that's why I do say pH is important, and understanding pH of your wort and your beer is important, but it's a subtle thing, noticeable, but small. Yeah, but beer, water in general is like the last thing you mess with. You got to get fermentation nailed down first. Once you've gotten fermentation nailed down, then you can start tweaking the water and making a good beer great with these small adjustments. It's it's that final seasoning that the chef does at the stove.
Yeah, and actually, speaking of those fine adjustments, I had a second question. Was
sure.
And one of the takeaways I have from tonight is I need to buy the most recent version of your book, because of course I've read your book online, and I figured I'd read everything you had to say on the topic. So I'm glad to know that. Well, somebody who's been brewing for 10 years still needs to buy a book called How to Brew, but I'm going to do that and read it and try to learn some more. I'm looking forward to it. So we've talked about RO water, and then building up your brewing water from there using the calcium chloride and gypsum in particular. Are there any other water additions that we as homebrewers should have in our arsenal?
I mentioned magnesium earlier, and then forgot about it until now. Magnesium always gets overlooked. It's the sidekick to calcium, if you will. But it turns out as far as the yeast are concerned, they want magnesium. They need magnesium. Calcium they need, but not so much. They really need magnesium, and the malt supplies quite a bit of magnesium for them. Professor Graham Walker of was it Edinburgh? Anyway, he gave a good presentation last year talking about calcium blocking and the need for magnesium in worts. So when we brew with RO water and we add calcium salts back to get the calcium levels we're looking for and the sulfate and chloride levels, we tend to ignore magnesium. And so we'll have like 150 ppm of calcium in the water, for example. We're getting about 50 ppm of calcium from the malt and about 100 ppm of magnesium from the malt. But too much calcium prevents the yeast from being able to access the magnesium that they really need for cell reproduction. And so Graham Walker talks about wanting a magnesium to calcium ratio in the wort of 2-to-1. Whereas if you look at brewing waters, it's usually 2-to-1, 3-to-1, 5-to-1 calcium to magnesium. And that will work as long as you're taking that maybe 50, 100 calcium in the water and adding it to 50, while the 10 to 20 magnesium in the water is being added to 100 or 150 coming from the malt. But when you're brewing with RO water and not adding any magnesium and adding lots of calcium, that's when this magnesium calcium ratio gets thrown off. And especially if you're doing repitching of yeast batch to batch like a commercial brewery would, that's when magnesium deficiency can really impact brewing performance. The home brewing level, where we're using fresh yeast each time, tends not to be a big deal. The yeast are healthy enough, they have enough nutrients where they don't notice or really see this magnesium deficiency that may be occurring. That's the other aspect of water that I hadn't covered until now.
So what can we as homebrewers do to address that? And especially in my case, I do repitch yeast.
Oh, okay.
And yeah, I mean, does yeast nutrient, does that have that magnesium that might be required?
No, not really. Unless you're using like, what is it, Suburbia with dead yeast cells, then that would contain some. Epsom salts. Add, part of your sulfate contribution, use Epsom salts, magnesium sulfate. Order some magnesium chloride. If you're a big lager brewer, and adding calcium chloride to your lager, to your brewing water for lagers, then add some magnesium chloride as well. And magnesium chloride is not terribly stable. It absorbs water. So, it's something that you kind of got to order off Amazon and store carefully, but it's available. It's just not as readily available as, Epsom salts. Yeah, I mean, even me, when I brew, I pay attention to my water, but I just kind of as a background thing. I know what I'm working with from my tap water, or I do kind of easy additions of to get in the ballpark of 50 to 100 calcium. Adjust my sulfate to chloride ratio to favor the style I'm making. I don't measure my mash pH because I know it's going to be about right. It's going to be close enough. But then, that's experience. So mash pH is important, especially if you're all grain brewing. If you're extract brewing, then it's not really important because that's all been kind of done for you with the extract.
All right, I took notes. I want to make sure I have it right. So
Okay.
the optimal ratio of calcium to magnesium is 2 to 1.
Magnesium to calcium is 2 to 1 in the wort. Okay.
Magnesium to calcium. Okay.
2 to 1 in the wort, not in the water.
Got it.
In a typical wort, sorry?
So post runoff into the kettle?
Yes. The malt, the wort is going to supply about 100 to 150 ppm of magnesium and about 50-ish ppm of calcium. But there's not a lot of published data on that, and I'm not sure how much it varies, malt type to continent to year to whatever. Lots of variables, agronomic variables at play when it comes to malt and minerals. But in general, we're saying that the malt is going to supply those kinds of numbers. And so comparing that plus the water that you're using, you come out with, for an IPA, you're going to come out kind of a 1-to-1 ratio because of our propensity to add calcium salts. And 1-to-1 seems to work okay. It's when your calcium is much greater than your magnesium that you can start running into yeast growth issues and fermentation issues.
This has all been really great, John. I got to say thank you so much for coming on and talking
to
about all of this. And you've been such a support over the years for multiple brewers, getting people into the hobby and supporting the hobby like this, being able to come talk to us, when you're, 2 hours time difference away. That's really cool on your part, man. And it's like I said, from the bottom of our hearts here in the Chicagoland area, man, thank you so much. This has been
You're very welcome. I enjoy the opportunity to meet people and share a beer.
Yeah, this is truly informative, so thank you.
It was really nice hearing you talk, John. I hope to meet you in person. I had Jamil sign this book. I need you to too. So
I'd be happy to. Yeah. Okay. Well, I look forward to seeing you all in a future conference.
all right.
right.
Thanks, John.
Cheers.
Okay.
Cheers.
Yep.
Good night.
Good night.
Sure.
Good night.